There are prisons so brutal that their very existence defies the notion of humanity. Places where prisoners are not only punished, but forgotten, reduced to shadows in a world without hope. Here, survival does not depend on the sentence, but on strength, obedience, or pure luck. Today, you will discover 3 of the worst prisons ever recorded. Places where hunger, violence and torture are routine. Places where few leave alive, and those who leave are never the same again. Sit back, put on your headphones and get ready to dive into this story. Story number 1, The Nameless Prison, 2017, Macondo Democratic Republic, Africa. The heat was suffocating. The sun beat down on the dry land, turning everything into a desert of dust and despair. The truck rolled slowly along a rutted dirt road, shaking the men packed into the bed like they were cattle being led to the slaughterhouse. The smell of sweat, blood and fear permeated the air. Among them, Samuel Dlamini, a 32-year-old man, was trying to understand how his life had gotten there. A month earlier, he was a teacher in a small town in the interior of Macondo Democratic Republic, a fictional country in sub-Saharan Africa, marked by corruption, misery and despair. Now he was on his way to a prison that officially did not exist. Your only fault. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been arrested on a false charge. An influential politician was murdered in an attack, and government forces decided to arrest anyone who was near the scene of the crime. The police needed culprits, not evidence. In a country where the law did not exist for the poorest, Samuel was dragged from his home in the middle of the night without any explanation. Now, thrown into a truck with other faceless and nameless men, he knew his fate was sealed. Few left the prison they were going to alive. The trip took hours. The truck crossed a barren and lifeless territory, until it finally stopped in front of a huge rusty steel gate. Over it, no sign, no name, nothing that indicated the official existence of the place. Just makeshift watchtowers, where armed men watched from above, like predators scrutinizing defenseless prey. The guards ordered everyone to get down. Dust rose into the air as the prisoners were violently pushed out. There were no formalities, there were no processes, there were no records. But, whoever entered had no ID. The first impact was the smell. An unbearable odor of feces, urine and rotting flesh. The prison did not have adequate sewage. The corridors were dirty, rats ran between the prisoners' feet, and sick bodies mixed in with the filthy environment. Samuel tried not to show fear as he was pushed into the courtyard. He looked around and saw malnourished men, with their bones showing, sitting in the dust like forgotten corpses. Others had open, infected wounds, exposed to heat and flies. The guards laughed, taking advantage of the terror in the eyes of the new convicts. "Welcome to the last stop of your lives," said one of the officers, holding a wooden baton. "In here, there are no rules, there is no justice. If you want to survive, figure out how." Samuel was pushed forward along with the others. The first order was clear: forced labor or punishment. The prison functioned as an exploration camp. Detainees were used as slaves to dig holes in the barren earth, carry stones and build structures that never seemed to end. Those who tried to resist were brutally beaten in front of others, as an example. On the first day, Samuel was taken to a collective cell. The space should hold a maximum of 10 people, but there was more than 50 prisoners crowded there. The heat was suffocating, the air heavy, and the only source of water was a filthy bucket in the corner of the cell, shared by everyone. During the night, Samuel was unable to sleep. "I heard moans of pain, desperate murmurs and, at times, the muffled screams of someone being dragged out. Men were taken out in the middle of the night and never returned. Rumors spread among the prisoners. Each week, some were taken and simply disappeared. No one knew whether they were executed or sold to armed groups in need of labor. The next morning, work began. Under a scorching sun, Samuel was forced to carry heavy stones for hours, without the right to rest. The food was a meager portion of sour porridge, served in dirty bowls without cutlery. Time lost its meaning inside prison. The days were endless, the nights were suffocating. Samuel's body began to waste away rapidly. Hunger gnawed at his insides, his muscles ached, and his skin burned under the merciless sun. In just a week, saw men die of malnutrition, others succumb to infections, and some simply surrender to their fate, lying on the ground and waiting for death. The violence was constant. The guards acted brutally, beating prisoners for no reason. Groups of inmates formed small gangs to fight for scraps of food. But the worst was yet to come. In the second week, Samuel realized that his cellmates were slowly disappearing. In silence, they began to whisper about an even scarier truth. Every 3 days, guards chose a group of prisoners and took them to an isolated wing. None of them came back. "They use us as bargaining chips," muttered one of the older prisoners, with a blank look. "They sell us to whoever pays the most. For paramilitary groups, for farms that need slave labor, for anyone who wants to use a body without an identity." Samuel swallowed. Now he understood the true purpose of that place. It wasn't a prison. It was a human slaughterhouse. And he knew that sooner or later, your turn would come. Samuel woke up breathing heavily. His body was drenched in sweat, and his mind took a few seconds to remember where he was. Hell was not a nightmare. He was still there. The moans around him were constant. Some prisoners were starving. Others, infected with disease, trembled on the ground, covered in open wounds, awaiting a fate that would never be merciful. Those who fell ill were simply ignored. Nobody helped. Death was part of the routine. In the cells next door, inert bodies mixed with the filth. Some prisoners held out for weeks without eating, without drinking, just existing until their bodies gave out. Others took a faster route. They used any piece of cloth or improvised rope to get rid of that place in the only way possible. Samuel knew he couldn't allow his mind to get to that point. But time worked against him. His body was increasingly weak. Bones began to appear under his skin, his strength was disappearing every day, and hunger was making him delirious. The worst was the thirst. The only water available was in a filthy bucket in the corner of the cell, shared by dozens of prisoners. Many had already died after drinking it. The taste was rotten, the smell of something rotting inside her. But for those who were dying of thirst, there was no choice. That day, the guards entered the cell again. 4 prisoners were chosen at random and taken out. No one knew what happened to those who were taken during the night. They just disappeared. "They sell us," muttered an old prisoner, sitting in the corner of the cell, observing the scene. "They exchange us for weapons, money, anything that has value. Whoever goes, never comes back." Samuel said nothing. But now he knew he needed to act before he was next. The days passed. More and more bodies disappeared from cells. Hunger increased. The smell of death permeated the corridors. Samuel noticed that the guards were watching the prisoners more closely. They noticed who was weaker, who couldn't last long. These were taken first. So, he started pretending. Even with his body weak, he tried to remain standing, forcing his muscles to move. When the guards passed by, he made a point of appearing strong. "I didn't want to be seen as disposable." That night, he heard the screams again. The truck arrived, and more men were dragged out. Samuel lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of death, waiting for the moment when his name would be called. But he survived another night. A week later, a group of new prisoners arrived. Thin men, covered in bruises, some with completely blank looks. Samuel saw something different in them. They seemed more organized. During the early hours of the morning, he heard whispers. A plan was being formed. The new prisoners had information. They said that one of the armed groups that bought the detainees was dissatisfied with the prison. They claimed they were sending prisoners who were too sick and unsuitable for forced labor. If that were true, the prison system's days were numbered. But they didn't want to wait. They wanted to escape before that. The next night, it happened. Samuel was sitting, trying to ignore his hunger, when he heard the first bang. An explosion shook the prison corridors. The new prisoners had managed to hide improvised explosives. The rebellion began. Chaos took over the place. The cells were opened, and the inmates ran into the hallways, attacking the guards with anything they found. Samuel knew that this was his only chance. Even though he was weak, he ran as fast as he could. The screams echoed everywhere. Guards shot at prisoners. Blood stained the walls. But Samuel didn't stop. He jumped over the bodies, crossed the corridors and ran towards the main gate. In the midst of the confusion, he saw one of the new prisoners holding a stolen machine gun. The man shouted something before opening fire on the guards. Samuel took advantage of the moment and continued running. The light outside blinded his eyes. For a moment, he thought he would never see the sky again. But it was there. I had managed to get out. In the distance, he heard more shots, more explosions. But he didn't look back. The nameless prison was falling. And, for the first time, someone escaped that hell alive. The next morning, international newspapers received information about the arrest. The government tried to deny its existence, but the evidence was too strong. Drones filmed the wreckage. Hundreds of bodies were found buried in clandestine graves. The prison was officially closed. But Samuel never appeared again. They say he managed to cross the border and disappeared forever. Others claim he was found and eliminated before telling his story. The only certainty is that the nameless prison existed. And for years, men were thrown there to be forgotten. But someone managed to get out. And, for the first time, the world knew what really happened in that hell. Story number 2, The Concrete Labyrinth, 2019, South China, Asia. Yellow light from lamps flickered across the cracked ceiling, casting jagged shadows in the narrow, damp hallways. The smell of mold, sweat and something rotten mixed in the stuffy air. The peeling walls looked alive, covered in moss and leaks. This place was known only by one name among the prisoners, the Labyrinth. Officially, it was called the Shanghai Rehabilitation Center, a maximum security prison located in southern China. But anyone there knew there was no rehabilitation, only survival. With a capacity for 5,000 prisoners, the penitentiary housed more than 20,000. Each cell, designed for 4 inmates, held at least 15. Among the newcomers was Tao Wei, a 41-year-old former factory worker. He was convicted of a crime he didn't commit. Accused of robbery and conspiracy against the government, he was taken without trial, without the right to defense. Like thousands of other political prisoners and common criminals, he was now part of the machinery that kept the prison running. From the first day, he understood that this was no ordinary prison. It was a parallel world, with its own laws and hierarchies. Those who controlled everything were not the guards, but the gang leaders. Within the walls, the state was irrelevant. True power was in the hands of those who could impose fear. Tao was thrown into a cramped cell with 20 other men. The heat was unbearable, the space tiny. There were no beds, just a filthy floor where the prisoners slept crammed together, taking turns lying down. The only food served was a watery mixture of rice and rotting vegetable scraps. Some vomited when eating, but their hunger was greater than their disgust. What scared him most, however, was not hunger or tiredness, but the strange silence that dominated the place. In normal prisons, you would expect to hear screams, threats, riots. In the labyrinth, silence reigned, broken only by whispers and distant footsteps. This silence did not mean peace. It meant terror. On the first night, Tao noticed that some prisoners disappeared. There was no explanation. Someone slept next to you and, in the morning, they were simply not there. The guards never commented. The other inmates pretended not to notice. Rumors circulated. They said the missing were taken to forced labor, extracting coal in underground mines where the air was toxic. Others spoke of medical experiments conducted on living prisoners. But the most feared version was that some were sold, transported in trucks to unknown places. On the second day, Tao understood the hierarchy of the place. Each corridor was dominated by a different gang. There were drug dealers, murderers, ex-soldiers. But the most feared group was called the Untouchables. The Untouchables did not speak, they did not interact with the other prisoners. They were tall, strong, with identical markings on their necks, as if they were a select group of something larger. They never needed to get blood on themselves. If someone disrespected them, an ordinary prisoner would do the dirty work. Anyone who tried to confront them disappeared. On his third night, Tao realized he was being watched. Two Untouchables followed him silently. He didn't know why. I didn't want to find out. That morning, he decided to act before it was too late. Blending in with the prisoners working in the prison laundry, he managed to steal a small piece of wire. With that, he undid the lock on the cell's ventilation grill. It was cramped, dirty, full of insects. But it was an escape route. He waited until midnight, when the guards changed shifts. While his cellmate slept, he slipped into the ventilation duct and began to crawl in the dark. The smell was unbearable, and every movement made a metallic creak echo through the corridors. After what seemed like hours, he reached an open space above a sewer pipe. Below him, there was only darkness. I didn't know if the drop was 1 meter or 10 meters. But he had no choice. He closed his eyes and jumped. The filthy water swallowed him. He struggled to emerge, the stench filling his nostrils. The underground canal was narrow and dark. He followed the current, not knowing where he was going. After minutes that seemed eternal, the water spat him into a fetid lake outside the prison walls. He looked around, shaking, taking a deep breath for the first time. I was free. But he knew that the labyrinth wouldn't forget him so easily. In the following days, the government made no mention of the escape. It was as if nothing had happened. But prisoners kept disappearing. The prison system continued to function. The only proof that the labyrinth existed was Tao Wei. He disappeared into rural China, never seen again, as if he were just another ghost escaping from hell. But as long as that prison existed, other prisoners would continue to disappear, and the truth would never be known to the world. Story number 3, The Underworld of Torture, 2022, San Tadeo, Latin America. The cell was a dark, dirty and stuffy cubicle. The smell of dried blood permeated the peeling walls, and the floor was a mixture of dust, urine, and dead rats. The heavy air made every breath an effort. This wasn't just a prison, it was a hole forgotten by the world, where only the strongest survived. A San Tadeo penitentiary, in Latin America, was not administered by the government, but by the prisoners themselves. Officers and guards were part of the scheme, allowing the most violent factions to control everything. Those in charge there were the most dangerous criminals in the country. No one entered and left San Tadeo without paying a price. Among the newcomers was Mateo Herrera, a 38-year-old man, convicted of a crime he did not commit. Unjustly arrested for police corruption, Mateo already knew what awaited him. Former police officers were the preferred target of criminals inside prisons. It didn't matter if he was guilty or innocent. For inmates, he was just another traitor ready to be eliminated. When he was thrown into the cell, he felt heavy eyes on him. Every dark corner seemed to hide something worse. The rules were simple: if he wanted to survive, he would need to choose a side. On the first night, he heard screams. The prison corridors were a silent battlefield, where those who crossed the wrong line were never seen again. The next morning, Matteo was taken to the courtyard. The place was divided between factions. Members of each group sat together, eating, talking, and observing the environment like predators analyzing their prey. In the center of the courtyard, a slight man was on his knees, surrounded by 5 others. The trial had begun. His crime? Having stolen food. The leaders decided they needed an example. Without warning, one of the men pulled out a sharp piece of iron and buried it in the kneeling prisoner's leg. The scream cut through the silence. Nobody did anything. Matteo realized that there was no right or wrong. Just power. In the following days, he met the real rules of prison. Everything had a price. Food, protection, even permission to sleep without being attacked. If he wanted to survive, he would have to pay. But Matteo had no money, no allies. It was then that he received an offer. A tall man, full of tattoos covering his arms, approached. He was known as the Knife, leader of one of the factions that commanded San Taddeo. "You can be useful to us," he said, with a dry smile. "Or it could be just another piece of meat waiting to rot." Matteo knew what that meant. If you accepted, would have to do the faction's dirty work. If he refused, he would be an easy target. There was no choice. From that day on, it became 2 Holmans from El Cuchillo. The first task was simple: watch a hallway during the night. An easy job, but it showed that he was on the right side. Over the next few weeks, he began to rise through the ranks of the faction. He learned who controlled drug trafficking inside the prison, who the informants were, and which guards accepted bribes to turn a blind eye. But nothing came for free. In the 3rd month, he received an order. A newly arrived man was marked for death. Matteo was supposed to do the job. If you refused, would become next on the list. That night, the sound of footsteps echoed through the damp corridors. The target was sleeping, not knowing that this would be his last day. Matteo held the improvised weapon he received and slowly approached. He didn't want to do that. But there was no other option. When he raised the gun, he hesitated for a second. It was enough. The man woke up and fought desperately, kicking Matteo away. The noise woke up other prisoners. Chaos spread throughout the cell. Guards came running. Not to stop the fight, but to watch. Matteo was beaten until he lost consciousness. When he woke up, he was alone, thrown in an isolated cell. The swollen face, the aching bones. The knife or treu. He didn't need Matteo anymore. In the following days, Matteo realized that was marked for death. His only chance was to escape. That morning, he put into practice a plan he had been devising. He had discovered that one of the prison's sewage tunnels led to a river. During the guard's shift change, he managed to unlock a grate and crawl through the filthy canal. The stench was unbearable, but he continued. The tunnel was narrow, dark and claustrophobic. For minutes that seemed like hours, he crawled across the muddy ground, feeling rats run over his legs. The air became heavy, oxygen was rare. But in the end, the light appeared. The tunnel ended in a muddy river. Matteo threw himself into the current, letting the water carry him. His body was weak, but his mind was firm. He survived. The next morning, the guards noticed the escape. The penitentiary went on alert, but Matteo was already far away. The knife was never punished. The prison continued to operate exactly as before. But Matteo proved something few have achieved. Someone made it out of San Taddeo alive. And his story would be told.